Hello everybody. How are you all doing today? In day flippity gibbet of lockdown. I don't even know what day we're on anymore. I am on antibiotics for this horrible chest infection, which is nice. I mean, honestly, some of the stuff I was coughing up, I think I said, was like Weezer bogies. It was so gross. Which I'm sure you all really wanted to know, especially around about lunchtime if you're watching this, or in fact during any meal time if anyone is eating anything at the moment. Try not to picture the stuff I was hacking up out of my lungs, because it will put you off your food. On that note, Alex and Z are feeling pretty optimistic right now, I would say. They have discovered the steeple of rock, a tower of rock that stretches up towards the top of the prison. They don't know whether it leads to a way out or whether it just dead ends up there somewhere, but they have found it. They have broken into the infirmary and stolen some equipment that they think might be able to help them climb. Things like rubber tubing and bone pins and hammers. Stuff that really, really might give them a shot at this. They've given it all to Simon. Simon has locked them back in their cells until they're ready to make a break for it. And he's disappeared. Hopefully, he will come back. We shall see. And they've discovered more and more about the horrific things that are happening inside Furness Penitentiary as well, including a lot of dead bodies yesterday. Alex has just been locked back in his cell, and he's a bit worried really that he's not going to see Simon again. Are we worried? We might be. I don't know. Okay, so settle down. Deep breath. Well, at some point my phone might go because the doctor is calling me back. So I apologise if that happens. Okay. Doubts. It was as if this time the darkness had weight, substance. It pressed down on me, making my arms and legs and neck feel like they were cased in concrete. I let myself drop, then sat there in the corner of the tiny cell, waiting for feeling to return to my limbs. Part of me couldn't believe what had just happened. It was easier to think that the whole thing had been in my head, that I'd been stuck here in my cell all this time, fighting imaginary enemies. Except I could still feel the Weezer's grip around my throat, fingertips on my windpipe. I knew that if there was light and a mirror in here, I'd be able to see the bruising on my neck, like someone who'd been hanged on the gallows. My entire body still throbbed, but the pain was a welcome diversion from my thoughts. I shifted on the uncomfortable stone, licked some of the moisture from the wall to quench my thirst. I wondered again whether Simon would return, or whether he'd already be making his way up the steeple. He hadn't needed us at all, not really. It was him who'd found the rock, who'd made the assumption that freedom lay at the top, and he'd probably already thought of using the medical equipment to help him climb it. All he'd wanted from me was reassurance that his plan would work, even if I didn't think it would. He'd gotten that, and there was no other reason for him to come back for us. The lightless air seemed to thicken, filling up the cell and closing over my mouth. I choked, tried and failed to draw a breath. My lungs burned. A high-pitched whistle began to ring in my ears. But it was just panic. I knew enough to recognise it and inhaled twice through my nose, breathing out slowly and feeling the oxygen hit my veins like a drug. Knowing Simon was up there, that he'd be coming back for us, had given us the illusion that we were free. It lessened the power of solitary purely because we weren't trapped, we weren't isolated, we weren't alone. With him gone, however, the cell became a tomb. And that wasn't the only reason I felt the panic gnawing at my stomach again. Deep down, I knew Simon's plan wouldn't work. It couldn't work. Yes, I'd had the flash of inspiration about the climbing gear, but it had never been serious. I'd been clutching at straws and only saw it as a real possibility because, well, I was desperate, delusional. Simon, too, had only gone along with it because he had nothing else. And when reality denies you the tools you need for survival, you grab them from wherever you can. And if we couldn't get out, then what? We'd probably live, but we wouldn't be alive. Not in the way we were now. We'd become rats who devoured the living, or black suits who terrorised them. We'd be demons, the living dead, and the thought was unbearable. I wished I'd kept that scalpel. I stared into the darkness, hoping that my brain would conjure up some company, someone, anyone to help me pull free of this cloud of depression. I saw the strands of silk suspended in the distance, as if there were no walls between them and me, and sure enough they began to coil into a body. But the image wouldn't solidify, shimmering above the invisible ground like a heat haze. "Donovan?" I asked the ghost, hoping to see a familiar face, but something in my head wouldn't let him form. Either I'd forgotten what he really looked like beneath his monstrous new flesh, or I knew he was dead. I called his name again, and the figure replied with white noise, the voice lost in static. "I'm sorry," I said, reaching out for him. "I'm sorry I couldn't save you." The image didn't change, as blurred as the reflection in a disturbed puddle, but suddenly the voice became clearer, like a radio being tuned. "It's not too late," he replied. "You don't have to free me to save me." I frowned, but the phantom was dissolving like salt in water. I tried to bring him back, tried to picture his face, but I couldn't recall it. All I could see was what he had become, the monstrous visage, the cold eyes, that face-splitting grin. And right then I knew that I'd never be able to remember him the way he was. I'm not sure how long I cried. Just minutes, probably, but it could have been hours. At first, heaving sobs racked my exhausted body, but after a while they softened to pathetic whimpers, mules better suited to a kitten. I wrapped my arms around myself, pretended they were my mum's or my dad's or Donovan's or Z's or anyone's, but they carried no warmth, no comfort. Not here, alone, at the bottom of the world. I straightened up, feeling my spine crack, then picked up the grill. I smashed it against the toilet pipe, the clang of metal on metal shaking the sadness from me, helping my mind pull itself back together. "What now?" I asked. There was a pause, then Z's muted reply. "Wait for Simon." "And if he doesn't come back?" Another pause. "He has to." Even through solid rock, with no staccato words, I could hear the unvoiced question at the end of Z's statement. I started hammering out why, but then changed my mind, realising that it was pointless. Instead, I smacked out a question. "Any other ideas?" "Nope," came his reassuring reply. "You?" The last of Z's echoes almost concealed footsteps above me, and I held my breath, wondering if I'd been wrong about Simon. Maybe he was back after all, about to pull open our hatches and take us back to the steeple. At least that way we could die trying to do something, trying to save ourselves. I heard the creak of a hatch opening, but it wasn't mine. There were more scuffled footsteps overhead, but none of the scratching and snuffling of a rat. I waited to hear the hatch slam back down, but nothing happened. "Z?" I hammered out. There was no reply. I tried again, cursing him for having a name that began with Z. Still nothing. I felt my heart sink into my stomach, stewed in acid. "Come on," I said, smashing the grill against the pipe randomly in the hope I'd get a response. I thought I heard something from outside, a cry of pain, but the ringing in my ears was too loud to be sure. "Z!" I yelled, knowing he wouldn't be able to hear me. Had they taken him? Jesus, had they taken him to the infirmary? Something whacked against the pipe in Z's cell, hard enough to sound like a bomb going off in my head. It struck again, even louder than before. What the hell was he doing in there? Trying to tunnel his way into the sewer? I put the question to him in a series of frantic strikes with my own grill. No reply. Then the deafening clangs came again. 23, 8, 1, 20. What? My heart lifted. Still adrenaline-fueled, but not on the verge of giving out as it had been moments ago. It was such a relief to hear him that I just sat for a moment, smiling at the wall. Then I started hammering out another message. "Thought I heard something." It took forever. "Nothing," he replied. The sound of his strikes loud enough to make my brain vibrate. I wondered if maybe he'd knocked his toilet pipe loose or something, if that could explain the increase in volume. After waiting an age for him to say something else, I picked up my grill again and spoke. "You sure nothing's wrong?" "Nothing." "Z," I struck. You're acting weird. No response. Z! I rubbed my palm, prepared for more blisters. Z! If we ever did get out of here, I was making him change his name. The blows from his cell began again, and I listened carefully. Alex, the message started. The strikes still too loud, too powerful. What makes you think I'm Z? Choices. Even before the last chime faded, I knew what had happened. Despite the heat in my cell, the sweat that poured down my face from the smashing the pipe, I felt my blood run cold, gooseflesh erupting on my skin. Z was gone. The black suits had taken him. It had been them trampling above my cell, Z's hatch opening. It was probably one of the guards in there right now. I could picture them grinning as they led me on, their dull laughter fading into the passageway as they carted Z off to his fate. I tried to think. Had they heard anything that could give us away? Anything to indicate we were planning to escape? No. We'd been talking about Simon, but that was before the footsteps above me. I doubt they'd heard our plans, and even if they had, they probably wouldn't have decoded it. Still, it wouldn't be long before Z was forced to talk. It was difficult to keep secrets when the freaks of Furnace were asking the questions. Maybe it would be better if they knew. Maybe I should even tell them, try to make a deal with the black suits. Would they let us live if we told them about Simon and the other lost boys? They wouldn't release us, but they might send us back up top to the relative luxury of Gen Pop with its daily slop and comfortable beds and cool showers. They might let us go home. Home. I was stunned by the fact I thought it, but there was nothing outside anymore, not for me. Furnace was my home, and I wanted to be back there. "Hey!" I shouted, pounding on the hatch. "Don't hurt him! I've got information you want!" It seemed like the first time in years that I'd raised my voice, and my throat was instantly raw. It didn't stop me. I smashed my fists against the metal even harder, knowing that the sound would barely even reach the floor above. Nobody came. I punched the hatch one last time and screamed with frustration. Why had they taken him and not me? It didn't make any sense. Not that anything did here. I knew well enough that there was no system to the atrocities in Furnace, no logic. The warden and his monsters did what they wanted, whenever they wanted. Anarchy disguised as regimented control. I felt like crying again, but I forced the emotion away. Z was in trouble, and me blubbing my eyes out in my cell wasn't going to do him any good at all. I needed Simon. I needed him to come back, to let me out. "Come on," I said, trying to project the thought through the stone, down the tunnels and up the slope to where the lost boys were hiding. "Come on, don't leave me here." I kept saying it, kept thinking it, kept picturing it being transmitted right into Simon's head. There's no such thing as psychic power. If you ask me, it's all a load of horse crap, which is why, when I heard the lever of my hatch grind open, I couldn't quite believe it. Crimson light flooded in like blood, and I peered through the mottled glow to see a familiar face above me, teeth like broken piano keys in a goofy grin. "You look surprised," the kid said softly, offering me his giant hand. "You think I was going to leave without you?" "Never," I replied, feeling the muscles in his arm tense as he hoisted me out. Z's hatch was still open, and a quick glance inside told me what I already knew. Simon saw the look in my eye and shook his head. "I couldn't get back in time," he whispered. "I was on my way. The suits nearly caught me. They were coming here, coming for him." "But the warden wanted us in here for a month," I said, eyeing the passageway warily. "They shouldn't have taken him." Simon shrugged, walking down the corridor towards the junction that led to the infirmary. He hadn't bothered to close my hatch this time, and I didn't either. I wasn't coming back, no matter what. "Never enough specimens," he muttered sadly. "Wheezers are always after fresh blood. Can't believe they let you live this long." "But the warden—" "Doesn't always get his own way," Simon interrupted. "Now we've got to move." "We're going after Z, right?" I asked, trotting to catch up and knowing what his answer would be. He spun around, silver eyes burning into my own. "You've got a choice to make, Alex," he said, the voice too old for his face. "And you've got to make it right now. You either go after your friend and you die inside anyway, or you cut loose and you come with me. We've got a shot at this. A real good one, I think. Once you're outside, you can come back, with the police, the army, everyone. But if you try to help Z now, or Donovan, or any of them, then you're as good as dead. He looked over his shoulder, his ear cocked. We need to go, right now, so make your choice. I felt like I'd gone back in time, promising feverishly to Donovan that I'd come back, bring the authorities before the warden could do anything to him. I'd failed, and if I went with Simon, who's to say I wouldn't fail again, leaving Z to rot? But what would happen if I went after him? I pictured myself walking him to the infirmary, trying to find Z, trying to fight off the wheezers as the black suits laughed at me, feeling them lift me up, the darkness flooding my veins, even as they strapped me to the mattress. And I made my decision. Not because I knew I could escape and return with the cavalry, not because I thought it was the best or the only way to help Z, but because I could still smell the stench of the wheezer on me, and I couldn't go back. Some hero. Let's go, I said, the words barely making it out of my mouth. I was so ashamed of them. Let's get out of here. We'll come back with help. Simon nodded, then sped down the corridor. We reached the junction, the path leading off to the main prison dead ahead, the infirmary off to our left. We'd have to pass it to get out, and for a moment my brain pictured Z inside, staring at the plastic curtain as we ran past, calling out silently to our backs. It was almost too much. Clear, said Simon, running again. I didn't look as we sped past the door, closing my ears to the sounds of screaming I could hear from inside, so high-pitched that I couldn't tell if it came from the wheezers or their victims. I didn't think about anything other than putting one foot in front of the other, and somehow I managed to stay upright, to keep Simon in my line of sight. The sound of the black suits seemed to be everywhere, deep voices that chuckled from inside the rooms we passed. But by some miracle, they didn't see us. They didn't hear us. I just kept running, because surely if I didn't look back, I didn't have to think about what I'd done. It was the sound of a phone that stopped me. The shrill, old-fashioned ring was so out of place here that I almost tripped over my own feet and had to brace a hand on the wall to stop myself from falling. We'd reached the junction that led up to the vault door. To our left was the final stretch of tunnel before the cavern. To our right lay the access to the warden's quarters. The phone was ringing from that direction, the same place where I'd sensed something wrong before, where I thought I'd seen... what? A cloud of something bad. Simon had bounded ahead, skidding to a halt only when he noticed I wasn't with him. "Come on!" he hissed. But I couldn't move. The phone was like an invisible hook that kept me in place, that tugged on my mind, threatening to reel me in. Every time it rang, the corridor seemed to grow darker, the walls pulsing and stretching like a living thing, some vast intestinal tract. A pain was growing right in the centre of my forehead, but inside my skull, not outside. With each shrill cry, the sensation spread, as though beneath my skin I was crumbling into dust. There was a door in the rock, halfway down the corridor, the phone's ring emanating from there. It seemed like it had been going on forever, a siren that had become an entity inside my own head. Simon was behind me. I could feel his hand on my arm, but I couldn't hear him. The only thing that existed was that phone. Then it stopped, and the pain exploded. I made out a voice, and I knew it straight away. The warden. It was faint, but at the same time it was like he was screaming into my ear. "Yes, sir," he said, 2 syllables like dynamite. "I understand, sir. It will be done." I couldn't hear who was on the other end, obviously, but I could feel it. After everything I'd witnessed in Furnace, the horrors I'd endured, this was so much worse. Because whatever it was didn't scare me. It called to me. And even though I knew it was rotten, evil, I found myself moving towards it, my limbs jerking like a puppet's. Something coiled around my brain, soft and rancid. Then I felt the corridor flip upside down, felt Simon's misshapen body beneath me, felt the wind rush past my ears as he fled. Each clumsy step carried me further from the voice, from its dark call, until all that was left was a gentle whisper that echoed like the last breath of a dying man. We flew through the vault door, the cavern ahead deserted. Simon didn't put me down until we reached the cracked rock where the ceiling dropped to the floor, and then only because we couldn't squeeze through together. He let me go first, hand on my head to make sure I didn't bang it. Then he was in after me. He waited, panting, the harsh light of the halogens following us through and giving his scarred, patchwork skin a weird, translucent sheen. I stared at him, wanting to thank him, but unable to quite recall how to talk. "Just give it a minute," he said. "The first time you hear it, you feel like you're going to die. It takes a while for the sickness to go." He was right. Something was sitting in my gut like a spiked ball, as if all the pain that had been in my head moments ago had sunk there, waiting to be digested. I rubbed my stomach, trying to settle it, and only when the nausea had ebbed away did I dare speak. "What was it? The warden?" Simon emitted a laugh, but there was no humour in it. "Him? No. He looks the part, but he's nothing. He's just another employee." He stopped as the sound of rocks hitting the ground seeped through the crack. It could have been anything, but we were still a little too close to the compound for comfort. I could just about see Simon scuttling up the rough slope ahead of us like a spider. "Don't worry about it, okay? Let's just get up to the steeple." I followed, far less graceful than him, but able to manage the handholds easily enough, despite the dark. We emerged in the tunnel at the top, taking a few jagged turns to get back to the cave. It was empty. "They're waiting for us there," Simon explained, leading the way through. I questioned him about the voice again, but he didn't respond, and it was only when we squeezed through the last crevice and found ourselves back in the immense gorge that he answered me. "Maybe it's best that you don't know, okay? At least until we're out in the open. We need to focus on this, or we're all going to end up dead. And we've sacrificed too much to mess it up now. Forget about it, Alex. Forget about everything you've ever seen down here. Just think about getting out." He turned away, called out softly into the darkness. Almost immediately a torch blinked into life. It did nothing to illuminate the cavern, but it did pick out two dirty faces huddling by the wall. "You made it," said Ozzy. "What about the other one?" "Suit's got him," Simon replied bluntly. "We've got Alex, though." Both Ozzy and Pete nodded at me, but I didn't acknowledge them. I couldn't stop thinking about what I'd felt outside the warden's quarters. The phone, the voice, the hooks in my mind. Even when I noticed the equipment piled up beneath Pete's crooked body, the clamps that had been twisted into hooks, the thick tube pierced by pins, I couldn't clear my head. All I could focus on was the warden and the person he had been talking to. And the fact that I'd left Z in there alone. "He okay?" I heard Ozzy ask, a small voice right on the edge of my consciousness. I felt their eyes on me, but I didn't look up, not even when I heard Simon's whispered response. "I don't know. He just heard the warden on the phone. He just heard him speaking to Alfred Furness." I'll do one more. "The only way is up." Oh, by the way, if you hear some clanky noises, it's because we're getting some work done on the roof. It's not like the house is collapsing or the wheezers are trying to get in. Simon was right. I couldn't afford to be distracted. I'd made my choice. I was here. So the only thing to do was make the best of it. If somehow the vast steeple of rock that towered over our heads led to the surface, or at least to a higher set of tunnels that connected to the outside world, then I could get help. I could come back for Z and for Donovan. It wouldn't be too late. And however crazy the idea sounded, however much I doubted it could work, it felt good knowing I'd never have to return to the hole or to the infirmary. Not without a goddamned army behind me. No, it was either climb to heaven or plunge to our deaths. There was no other way this was going to play out. I soon discovered I wasn't the only one who had to leave a friend behind. Pete's spindly legs and arms could never hope to drag his overstuffed torso up the wall. He could barely even walk. The kid cheered us on, talked us up as we got our kit ready, but his voice was cracked and filled with desperation. "I'm coming back," Simon must have told him a dozen times in the space of a few minutes. "I promise you, you have my word. I won't leave you here." It was like a mirror image of my life, and for the first time I wondered how many other people had tried to break out of Furness, saying the same words to their cellmates and friends and brothers. I'll bet it was far more than I realised, far more than the warden and the black suits ever revealed. It was a strange recognition, and even though I knew that nobody had ever made it out, that nobody had ever kept their promise and returned, it filled me with hope. Maybe we could do this. The plan was that Simon and I would make our way up the steeple, Ozzy keeping watch below with Pete. The younger kid had wanted to go, but he was more scared of heights than he was of the nightmares in the prison, and he knew he'd never make it. Besides, he didn't have the heart to leave Pete on his own. We had 2 20-metre coils of surgical tubing. It was thick stuff, but even so, Simon had doubled it up and twisted it into a spiral. The bulk of it would hang between us, and we both had a shorter length to hammer into the rock at regular intervals. Whoever was ahead would fix one strand of the makeshift rope every 15 metres or so, ensuring that if either of us fell, we wouldn't go far. Not unless the tube snapped, or the pins slipped out the wall, or the rock came loose, or our knots failed. "Ready?" Simon asked, scaring the doubts from my mind. I looked at him, at his lopsided smile, and wondered why I had ever questioned his motives. He'd come back for me, risking his life, even though he could have scaled the wall alone. "Nope," I said, my voice trembling. I took a deep drink of the water from the IV bag they brought with them, relishing the strength it lent to my muscles. "Me neither," he replied, his silver eyes flashing. "So let's do it." He handed me a pair of clamps and I toyed with them. They were like scissors, only with a wide, blunt end instead of blades. They were sprung so that when you squeezed the handles, the 2 prongs expanded, designed to keep wounds and rib cages open during surgery, but equally useful for wedging into small cracks in the rock. Next came a handful of long, tough bone pins and one of the hammers with a hooked end, which I looped onto my overalls. Simon took a moment to say goodbye, hugging the other 2 kids, the 3 of them sobbing. I stood by awkwardly, then waved a farewell once they'd parted. "We'll see you again," said Ozzy. "Real soon." "Not too soon, though," joked Simon. They laughed, wishing us a final good luck. Simon tied the flashlight to his overalls with a small section of tube, and for a moment we stood side by side, heads craned back, as we stared at the steeple, the rough red rock disappearing into an endless night above us. "Here goes nothing," I said. "Here goes everything," he answered, and we started to climb. It was harder than I'd imagined, much harder. The fissures in the pinnacle were jagged and uneven, and before I'd climbed a couple of metres, blood was threatening my grip. My muscles, weakened from lack of food and stripped bare by adrenaline, struggled to lift me, and each time I straightened a leg or tensed my arms, I thought they were going to fold. The only thing that gave me any comfort was the fact that the rock face angled inwards, rather than hanging out over the gulf of darkness below. This meant that when I felt myself losing strength, I could rest my body against the slope without fear of tumbling off. Simon had already taken the lead, his massive arm pulling him up while his smaller limb wedged him tightly in place. Each time he moved, the flashlight swung, making the shadows on the wall dart and stretch so that it was impossible to work out which holes were big enough to support me. One of my feet slipped from a narrow scar, and for a moment I thought I was a goner. We weren't yet 10 metres off the ground, but that was plenty far enough to break a leg or 2. I grabbed the rock like it was my best friend, cheek pressed flat against its warm touch. My heart was trying to thump its way out, and I didn't blame it. I mean, how many metres are in a mile? There was a long, long way to go. But I wasn't complaining. We were climbing. We were escaping. I pictured the black suits coming to pull me from solitary, the shock on their faces as they realised I was gone. They'd probably assume I was eaten by a rat, but they'd never know for sure. Not until I stormed back in with a rocket-propelled grenade and blew the bastards to pieces. I shuffled up another few metres, Simon pausing as he waited for me to catch up. I glanced down, saw that the light from his flashlight no longer reached the ledge. But there were 2 silver pennies glinting up at us that I knew belonged to Pete. I would have waved if I thought I could do it without killing myself. "We should start roping," he said as I drew level, and I was relieved to hear that he was panting too. "High enough now to do some serious damage if we fall. I'll plug while you climb. Then when you reach the end of the rope, you plug. I'll pull loose and we'll step up. That makes sense?" "Yes," I lied, wishing we'd gone over it on the ledge below. I figured I knew what he meant though, and while he pushed a bone pin into his end of the tube and started hammering it into the rock, I kept on climbing. It was tricky without the light, but I took it slowly, feeling my way up the steeple and testing every nook and cranny twice, 3 times before trusting it with my full weight. After a few minutes, I felt the length of rope connecting me to Simon go taut, and I braced myself against the rock, slipping loose the section that dangled from around my waist and pushing a pin through it. A couple of hammer blows later, and I was secured to the wall. Well, as secured as I was ever going to get, that was. "It's in!" I yelled, looking down at Simon in his bubble of golden light. He pulled his tube free, knowing that if he fell now, my length of rope would hold him, and he clambered up. His breathing was ragged when he reached me, but he was still smiling. "Great idea for the ropes," he panted. "Great idea for the climb," I replied. Then he was off again, overtaking me and scuttling up at speed. I made the most of my rest, relaxing my muscles and stretching my neck, hearing everything crack in protest. There was a tug on my waist as the rope reached its limit again, then the chime of metal on metal. "Your turn!" he called down. I rammed the hammer's hooked handle into the crevice where I'd wedged the bone pin. It was pretty tight, but after a couple of twists, the tube popped free and hung limply by my side. This was actually working. I started climbing again, buoyed up by our success, and it was only when I lifted my head to throw Simon a grin that I noticed something was wrong. "Turn your light off," I yelled. He looked down at me, shadow throwing his face into a frown. "What?" "Just do it. Turn it off. Look." I couldn't point, but I nodded, gesturing further up the steeple. He grumbled, but clicked off the flashlight, plunging the entire chasm into darkness. Well, almost the entire chasm. Maybe 10 metres or so above Simon's head, I could make out a soft glow emanating from the rock. It would have been easy to mistake it for daylight, the warm glow of a sunset, but I wasn't going to fall for that again. We were still way too deep. I carried on climbing, taking care not to make any noise. Simon obviously sensed my fear, waiting for me to reach him before speaking. "What do you think it is?" he asked. I shrugged, the motion knocking loose a pebble from the wall. It seemed to take a long time to hit the ledge below. The light could have been something from the prison, as we must have reached the level of the yard in general population by now. I pictured it on the other side of this slab of solid rock, the inmates running around inside like ants, with no idea that we were scaling this wall, that we were gunning for freedom. "Maybe they knocked a hole in one of the chipping rooms," Simon went on. "Maybe your explosion blew out the wall." Maybe, but not likely. Whatever the light was, it didn't look strong enough to be coming from any of the rooms in Furnace, and even as I watched, it seemed to flicker like a cinema projector. "Let's take it slow," I said, "and keep it quiet." We did, easing up the wall together, too nervous of drawing attention to ourselves by hammering in the pins. We'd covered maybe 5 or 6 metres by the time we noticed the gap in the rock ahead. The steeple was broken, a massive chunk of it was missing. The pillar of rock rose up again above the gaping crack, but there was no way we were getting past it unless we could scale the walls inside the cave. That's where the light was coming from. And not just light, I realised, but noise. A wet snuffling that could have been a vacuum cleaner held under water. I felt my stomach turn as I recognised the sound, but I refused to believe it. We eased up towards the split, the noise getting louder every second. The light was shaking now, trembling up and down and back and forth. I heard something tear, and the beam vanished altogether for a second before snapping back on, gold, tinged with red. 3 meters, 2, 1. We were there. It sounded like there was a party going on just above our heads. Stamping feet, grunts, snaps like somebody tearing chicken wings. I looked at Simon, grateful that I couldn't see his expression of fear and wishing that he couldn't see mine. We didn't speak, just nodded, tightened our grip on the wall and peered up over the lip of rock. The first thing I noticed was that the light came from a flashlight being held by an arm clad in black. But the arm itself wasn't attached to anything. It was being eaten by a naked, grotesquely muscled creature that looked like it might once have been a monkey or a chimp. It was squatting on its haunches in the middle of a small cavern, too engrossed in its meal to notice us. Behind it, on the floor, was the rest of the black suit. What remained of him, anyway? Even that was rapidly disappearing. 6 or 7 shadowed forms, just as twisted as the first, were stooped over the carcass, taking it to pieces like some living food processor. Every now and again one would turn to the walls and growl at the constellation of stars assembled there, silver eyes blinking on and off as they watched the carnage. 20 of them, 30 maybe. Rats. A whole nest of them, smack bang between us and the way out. No! Right. Hey, I did that without coughing. I must be getting better. Okay, 4 chapters. If I'm feeling okay tomorrow, we'll do what we did last time with Solitary. We'll do the last 4 chapters in one fell swoop, and we'll find out what happens at the end of Solitary. I know, as do most of you probably, but it's hopefully going to be a gripping final instalment. Anyway, thank you for joining me. Sorry about that noise. It sounds like a rat kind of purring, or some kind of horrific piece of machinery. Quite good sound effects. I should have done this with sound effects, you know. I should have had a little keyboard and played little tunes while I was reading to you. Anyway, maybe next time. I hope you'll have a really lovely day, and I will see you tomorrow for what will probably be the final part of Escape from Furnace Solitary. See you then.